Hello everybody, Roger says hey. A lot of you guys have been asking about Scarlett and how she's doing. She is doing fine too. She's always in the room with me when I record. It's just that she's quieter at times and kind of wild sometimes. But let me see if I can get her to say hi. Here we go. See everybody there, Scarlett. Oh, alright. Alright, let's go back. We gotta go back. Okay. Alright, well that was Scarlett and she's got her ball now. Well, you guys wanted to see Scarlett. Okay, so we're gonna get into the Can you just stop for a minute? We're doing a video. Okay, so we're up to weeks 5 and 6 of the Great War series. And again, we're going to be combining two videos into this one, but we're going to go through your comments. We're going to go through your comments in comment time first. So in the last video, Indy Nidell made mention that the technology hadn't really changed from, like, I think Napoleon to 1940, and I was really kind of confused why he was mentioning 1940, which was the kind of around the beginning of World War II. Mike Lavoie, I'm not sure how you say your last name, but he says, I think he meant that the methods of fighting a war that had developed by 1918 weren't drastically different from those used at the beginning of World War II. Combined arms warfare, air forces, submarines, etc. It was a much bigger leap from the Napoleonic mindset and tactics that still persisted at the beginning of the war to what came after. That makes sense. I actually now recall that, now that everybody's bringing this stuff up, I do recall learning kind of about the military history of the time and how there wasn't a whole lot of change between World War I and World War II. So yes, I guess that makes sense then. Racekis1 says, in 1914, nobody knew what the effects of machine guns would be. Artillery was vastly more powerful and accurate than in 1814. The armies numbered in the millions. Napoleon's Grand Army was 500,000 at its peak. The sheer scale and firepower of modern armies shocked everyone. Yeah, I was a little taken aback by how the generals didn't realize how harmful a machine gun would be to like a line of soldiers. I just thought that common sense would take over if you can see how the machine gun shoots the bullets. I mean, I would think that you would understand that it would basically just mow everybody down. I guess it's not as simple as that. I don't know. Shane Proster says that England's army was only professionals at the start, or volunteers as we call them. In European mainland armies, they tended to be a best mixture of conscript and volunteer troops. So I guess that also makes sense now that I recall that in learning about the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon did basically conscript most of his soldiers from what I remember. So yeah, that makes sense. Simon Simonovic says before World War I started, Serbia was fighting against the Ottoman Empire in the 1912-13 First Balkan War and against Bulgaria in 1913 in the Second Balkan War. Serbian weapons were imported mostly from France and Russia, so I'm assuming that's where the grenades came from, were France and or Russia. You know, the Balkan Wars are things that I remember from history, which is very vaguely. I don't remember anything about them. I just remember them being mentioned in our lessons. Yeah, I don't know anything about the Ottoman Empire. I don't know anything about the Balkan Wars. I can see how that would be an advantage for Serbia, having fought in some recent wars and having some of those more modern weapons available. Evil New, I guess, says if you get the impression the journals of this time were for the most part old men disconnected from the real world who made some pretty stupid and ignorant choices, keep watching the series, you ain't seen nothing yet. Okay, I guess I have more of that to look forward to then. Stanley Leonard Darmali says World War I artillery had vastly more range and accuracy than the ones used in the Napoleonic era. Yeah, when they were talking about how like the cannons were firing down onto the troops and just causing this massive devastation, I guess what I didn't realize was the shells were very different from what they were in the Napoleonic Wars. I guess back in Napoleon's day you had cannonballs that I guess it didn't really explode. They just caused a lot of damage when they hit stuff. I'm not really sure. Like, I don't really know how it works exactly, but the modern shells in World War I were explosives, so they would cause way more damage. They had a lot more range to them. With those things in mind, I guess I can actually understand how they would be way more deadly. And Josh Thomas Moore, I think you've shown up in a couple of my other comment times, but he says the hand grenades became widely used by European armies in the 16th century. A grenadier was a special soldier in a regiment who would throw a grenade. Later, the name Grenadier was given to regiments such as the British Grenadier Guards. Now, I do know the Grenadier Guards from the British, the Napoleonic Wars videos that I did mention them quite a bit. But when I heard their names, I was like, it reminds me of a grenade, but I feel like that's not technology that was in use back then. But apparently it was. And I didn't realize how old grenades were. They go back to the 1500s, which is, I guess it kind of, like, is not as super, like, elaborate technology. It's pretty primitive technology. All right, well, that'll do it for your comments. Obviously, I can't read through all of them. You know, you guys leave hundreds of them, which I really appreciate. I love reading through them. I love learning from them. So please keep it up. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into weeks 5 and 6. I'm just going to combine these two videos, one after the other in this. Week 5 is called The Rape of Belgium and the Battle of Tannenberg. Okay, so I don't really know what either one of those is referencing, so let's find out.
August 28, 1914. Throughout August 1914, as the war progressed in Belgium, France, and Serbia, the Austrian and German High Command either sanctioned or ignored the widespread execution and rape of civilians. A shocked and revolted world looked on. My name is Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Here's where we stood on the battlefields of Europe at the beginning of the week. In the west, there were 3 German armies, 750,000 men. The left flank was in Lorraine, and the rest were marching through Belgium at 30 kilometers per day, an amazing speed, and pretty much slaughtering the French armies they encountered. And the British Expeditionary Force under John French was approaching from the west. In the east, the Germans were on the retreat out of East Prussia, and the Russians were advancing. Now, in the west, after all the victories of the past few weeks, things were looking good for the Germans, but their reputation was doing anything but that. And the atrocities the German troops committed against civilians in the West grew and grew. In Dinant, German soldiers repairing a bridge were fired on by a few Belgian civilians, and as a reprisal, over 600 Belgian men, women, and children were shot. On August 20th, it happened in Andenne. There was even a printed announcement from German General von Bülow, posted in Liège, that read the following. The population of Andenne, after manifesting peaceful intentions towards our troops, attacked them in the most treacherous manner. With my authorization, the general who commanded these troops has reduced the town to ashes and shot 110 persons. In Tamines, 384 men were rounded up near the church and shot. In Rossignol, 122 people were executed for supposedly supporting the French army, who had just themselves been crushed there in battle. Now, there were dozens more such incidents, known collectively as the Rape of Belgium. But in Louvain, it was completely out of control. The Germans had occupied Louvain on August 19th, right? On the 25th, the Belgian army, coming from Antwerp, harassed the Germans. But once this was over, the German command decided the people of Louvain were to blame. So for the next 5 days, the German troops executed hundreds of citizens of both sexes, including many clergy, and burned the city and many of its famous medieval buildings. In the international press, there were horrible eyewitness accounts and even a headline in the New York Tribune, Germans sack Louvain, women and clergy shot. 10,000 civilians were driven from the city. In total, over 6,000 civilians are known to have been killed in cold blood in Belgium and France by Germans in the first weeks of the war. Now, I have to point out that some people today believe that the charges of war crimes against Germany in occupied Belgium and France are greatly exaggerated or even fabricated. But this is completely at odds with contemporary evidence. And it's important to note that these crimes were not only tolerated by military command, but in many cases, even sanctioned by them. The stories of German atrocities were particularly
beyond just World War I here. This just is like Apologize for the hairdryer going in the background, but I mean, this is unnecessary. Like, this right here perfectly illustrates the evilness that humans have. Some humans. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is like this. This is what we're capable of doing. For what reason? Like, just the unnecessariness of it, the brutality of it. It's just...
It's important to note that these crimes were not only tolerated by military command, but in many cases, even sanctioned by them. The stories of German atrocities were particularly abundant in the British papers, where propagandists wanted to move away from the killing of an aristocrat in a faraway country to atrocities closer at hand in Belgium as a moral imperative for fighting the war. Now, this would motivate the British troops enormously when, on August 23rd, the Germans ran into the British for the first time in the war at the Battle of Mons. Now, the German High Command had been mocking the British Army for weeks and joking that they should just send the police to arrest them. But the British regulars, the only fully professional army in Europe before the war, held off the numerically superior Germans for many hours, inflicting 3 times the losses they took themselves. German howitzers arrived in the afternoon, though, with which the British artillery could not compete, and the British began to retreat, parallel to the French retreat as the Germans quickly pushed through Belgium and slaughtered the unprepared French army. There was heavy fighting for the British along the retreat over the next few days, especially when they turned and held their ground on August 26 at Les Cateaux, long enough for thousands of men to withdraw in good order. A British general, Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, had decided to stop and fight as the Germans were so close and the rearguard divisions were becoming so scattered that a catastrophic battle was otherwise inevitable. Smith-Dorrien was a general who had seen a lot of action for over 30 years all over the world with the British colonial army, and he knew what he was doing. Although the action that day would prove deadlier for the British army than the D-Day invasion 30 years later, Smith-Dorrien would give his army a 12-hour start on the Germans. But the troops were exhausted, and there was now even talk in the air that the war would indeed be over by Christmas, but with Germany the victor. Although on the Eastern Front, things to that point hadn't been going well at all for the Germans, especially after their recent defeat at Gumbinnen, which caused the German retreat. After this, German Army Chief of Staff von Moltke dismissed his paranoid General von Prittwitz and brought General von Hindenburg out of retirement to replace him. Now, Hindenburg had retired in 1911, but unlike many of the European generals so far this war, Hindenburg had seen action, going as far back as the 1860s. Now, on the surface, things look good.
Hindenburg, what the Hindenburg... It's not a blimp. What is it called? It was like a blimp, I think. But anyway, I'm assuming that this is the guy that was named after. And I don't remember if it was during World War II or World War I when that, like, blew up, basically. You know, the Hindenburg disaster or whatever. I learned about that once upon a time, and I kind of forgotten all the details.
Seen action, going as far back as the 1860s. Now, on the surface, things look good for the Russians, right? But they had colossal logistic and communications problems. They didn't even encode their telegrams, so all wire communications could be monitored by anyone. And one tiny event occurred that had huge later repercussions. After the Battle of Gumbinnen, a note was found on a dead Russian officer that outlined most of the Russian plans for their offensive. Armed with this knowledge, Hindenburg and his second-in-command Ludendorff broke off the German retreat and decided to go on the attack. On August...
I feel like that's a very common thing in warfare, is where the enemy finds the battle plans, you know, somewhere like on an officer or wrapped in cigars or, you know, something like that. I feel like it's something that I hear about a lot when you study about wars. I don't know if that's actually the case or if it just feels like that, but I don't know. It's just, oh man, it feels like every war there's like battle plans are discovered somehow.
And Ludendorff broke off the German retreat and decided to go on the attack. On August 24th, the Russians collided with the Germans, and the Russian center made great progress, but it was a complete illusion. On the 26th, the German western flank cut through the Russian left and cut off communications. And on the 27th, the German eastern flank did the same thing to the Russian right flank. The Russian army was trapped in the middle, running out of basically everything, and on August 28th, they began surrendering in droves, nearly 100,000 men, with 50,000 more killed or wounded over the course of only several days. This was the most spectacular defeat of the war and made Hindenburg a German national hero, even if much of the credit rightly belonged to the ironically named German General Francois. Now, there was a village nearby named Tannenberg, where in a medieval battle, the Slavs had defeated the Teutonic Knights, and this village gave its name to the battle, which would become a big symbol of German pride. This was a big moment because it put East Prussia now totally under German control. But further south, Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, was having huge difficulties with control, which the Austrian army used as an excuse for wartime atrocities of their own. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had launched this war in the first place to teach Serbia a lesson, or maybe even end her existence. So there was no love lost between the two. And when Austria-Hungary invaded, it provoked widespread Serbian civilian resistance to the invading army. Guerrilla warfare. Now this really upset the Austrians, particularly their stuck-in-the-past aristocratic military leaders who wanted the war conducted on their terms, and they decreed that they would deal with civilian resistance ruthlessly. And they did, shooting, hanging, and bayoneting Serbian civilians, most of whom were innocent, men, women, and even children. But the Serbian guerrillas were good at creating chaos in the Austrian lines, often waiting for them to pass before sniping them with rifles from behind. This was effective, but it had its cost. An estimated 3,500 Serbian civilians were executed during just the first 2 weeks of the August campaign. And we have a lot of evidence of this because executing Serbian civilians was not something the Austrians tried to hide. In fact, Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf wanted people to see these punishments, so many of the executions of civilians were photographed and the photos were published. Mass executions and mass graves. And here we are at the end of the week, with Germany ascendant in both the East and the West, and a terrified citizenry, including over 1 million Belgians, fleeing from the invaders. Now, many formerly anti-war people decided this week that the war was, after all, justified, and that Germany must be stopped at all costs to preserve civilization in Europe. And we see, years later, that the massacres of civilians by the Germans in August 1914 were a direct factor in the harsh conditions imposed on Germany after the war, which indirectly, or maybe even directly, led to Nazism and the Second World War.
I'm a little speechless actually moving into the second video on this. I said we were going to take a break, but I feel like I need to after that. It's just weird for me to think about all of this stuff happening over in Europe, because in my lifetime, you know, I viewed Europe as a relatively peaceful, democratic, civilized place. You know, you don't think of these, I don't think of Germany and Austria as countries that would do these sorts of things. Of course, now they're different. This was 100 years ago, so, you know, it's different now. But still, just the thought of this stuff happening just 100 years ago in Europe, where I don't know, it just seems unfathomable that it would happen today. Like, I can imagine what it would be like if we were getting images like this coming out of Germany or France or Austria today. Like, I understand that there are atrocities that are happening still like this in the world. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, like, in these places, if this was going on today on this scale, you know, it's just, it would be bizarre. I don't know. I'm just having a hard time kind of wrapping my head around the fact that this stuff took place. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the next video, I guess.
September 4th, 1914. After a month of fighting, the nations of Europe now all knew that this was a new type of war, with carnage on a scale never before seen. But the technology and logistics of modern warfare also brought with it a whole slew of unforeseen problems, especially as the war was about to go global and truly become a world war. I'm Indy Nidell, and this is The Great War. Here's how the war looked at the beginning of the week. A Russian army had been spectacularly destroyed by the Germans at Tannenberg. The British and French were retreating to regroup around Paris, the Germans hot on their heels, and the whole world was now telling tales of German and Austrian executions of civilians in occupied territories. Traditional war had always had its fair share of difficulties, right? Transportation, supplies, and communications always seemed to go wrong, and World War I was no exception. But we begin to see that almost anything could screw up the best-laid plans on an extraordinary scale. Let's take a look at the war in the East. The Russian army may have just suffered a catastrophic defeat against Germany, but they were doing a lot better against Austria-Hungary. Now, the Russians outnumbered the empire roughly 750,000 to 500,000 in troops and had an even greater advantage in machine guns and artillery. Austria-Hungary, though, had won 2 quick victories over the Russians, but it was all downhill from there. Austrian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf was overconfident, and he had a complicated plan to let the Russians in the south advance and then swing around them in the north. See, Hötzendorf was one of the major Austrian war hawks, dreaming of a glorious empire that stretched down to Africa and even to the Middle East. But in practical terms, he was a terrible general. He sort of ignored the fact that the Russians were heavily reinforcing in the north, and by September 1st, they began to bear down on Conrad with close to twice as many men as the Austrians had. Russia took Lemberg, one of the largest cities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on September the 3rd, and Austria was forced to retreat to the Carpathian foothills. So far this war, Austria-Hungary had been in a constant state of disaster, partly because of overstretch, but partly because of incompetence. This would not change, but there were also totally unforeseen problems, chronic language difficulties being a big one. The Austrian army had soldiers from all the many nations of its empire, Hungarians, Czechs, Bosnians, you name it, and troops from one region would repeatedly attack others of its own army, mistaking them for Russians because of the unfamiliar language. And the Slavic troops would simply desert at times because of being made to fight other Slavs, and sometimes even join the Russian army. There were also the huge open spaces of Eastern Europe. Units would become lost, sometimes for days, and just finding the enemy was a daunting task. Now, Russia had problems of its own, though. Although it had an endless supply of men, it could only afford to feed and clothe a fraction of them in an army. So you could avoid the draft for a variety of reasons, like if you were the family's main breadwinner. So in early August, for example, 2 million Russians suddenly got married, which would be funny if the ones who went to war weren't all dying. The problems of modern warfare were also being felt in the West, but in different ways. The Franco-British retreat had started. British commander John French was considering retreating beyond Paris, though, and when he learned that the last Belgian fortress had fallen to the Germans, he thought of abandoning the whole thing and retreating all the way to Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast. He had nothing but disdain for his allies, especially his opposite number, French General Lanzerac. Now, Commander French said that the French army was the sort of people that he did not wish to continue fighting with, which is insane. I mean, they were at war, they were allies. But the retreat was managed really well. No big guns were captured, and there was never any danger of being surrounded. Now, part of this was that the French army now had a huge advantage: the French railway system. They could move around troops lots faster than the Germans could follow on foot. And follow on foot they often had to do. The automobile was still a fairly new creation, and most of the thousands of German trucks used broke down this month. The Belgians had, of course, sabotaged their own railways, and it would take weeks for the Germans to get them in order again. The Germans had problems not only with their cars, though, but also big ones with their horses, which were, by this point, dropping dead on the roadside from hunger and exhaustion, but were needed to haul the dreaded German guns. The German armies were following the sweep of the schlieffen-plan, but on September 2nd, this changed. Instead of going to the west of Paris, they were now diverted to head east of it. This was because of good defense. One German army was stopped by Lanzerac at Guise and forced to head southeast, and the other had faced strong British support the whole way, and the sweep was abandoned. Lanzerac was a very cautious general, and though he was repeatedly ordered by his superiors to counterattack during the retreat, he wouldn't, saying he wanted to wait until open ground to use his artillery. Eventually, even with Lanzerac's success stopping the German advance, he was removed from command for being too cautious. Now, British Commander French was happy when Lanzerac was relieved of command, but he was far from happy when Lord Kitchener, British Secretary of State for War himself, had arrived in full Field Marshal dress uniform at the end of August to meet directly with French and tell him to damn well work together with his allies and not simply retreat to safety. The British remained near Paris. The schlieffen-plan, as it was conceived, might have been successful if Moltke hadn't diverted so many of his troops away. He had pulled troops away to fight the Russians, troops to fight Antwerp, for the fortress of Namur, but, you know, that's war. So as the armies neared Paris, the German armies were now reduced in size to below that of the French and British, and they were much lower in ammunition. Now you can see that this was a bed of roses for nobody at all. And something else we start to see around now. This war was no longer a European land war, but was becoming an actual world war on both land and sea. Japan and Britain had had an alliance since 1902, and in mid-August, Japan demanded that Germany withdraw her warships from Chinese and Japanese waters and hand over the port of Tsingtao. And on August 23rd, Japan declared war on Germany. The Japanese landed 23,000 troops beginning September 2nd for the siege of Tsingtao, which would last all autumn. Kaiser Wilhelm said,
The Japanese were involved in this? Okay, I didn't know that. Oh my gosh. I don't know what countries I thought were involved in World War One, but I thought it was mostly just like Europe and then like I guess like Australia and the US got involved. Maybe I don't know. I don't know anything. I really don't know. I wasn't expecting to see Japan involved in it though. I didn't know that Britain and Japan had an alliance at this time either. Oh my gosh.
Wilhelm said, "It would shame me more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians." He said a lot of stuff like that. New Zealand had its first engagement of the war, occupying German Samoa on August 29th to take the radio station there, one of several stations the Germans had in the Pacific. Now, the occupation took place without fighting, but it brought the war to the Pacific. This was not the first seizure of a German colony during the war, though, Togo having surrendered to the British and French 3 days earlier.
We're in Africa.
And for Britain on her home islands, this was a dangerous time. Since the entire professional army had been sent to Belgium, and Germany had plenty of troops available to land in the east of England, there was a prospect of invasion. And with a bit of luck, an invading force might elude the Royal Navy. But on August 28th, at Heligoland, 3 German cruisers were destroyed by the British without a ship sunk, ending the threat. This was the first real naval engagement of the war. And as you all know, it was very far from the last. So now, we have an actual world war on 3 continents, which brings with it all of the new problems of modern warfare. And though many of these are still connected with transportation, communication, supplies, and even language, they're on a scale like never before. And just as all problems in war cost lives, we'll see millions die as nations try to get a grip on 20th century warfare.
Wow. Yeah, that last like 2 or 3 minutes of this video just proved that I'm way more ignorant about World War I than I ever thought I was. It's actually sounding a lot like World War II in a lot of aspects. Because we have a Pacific theater now, we're in Africa, we're worried about a German invasion into England. So there are some parallels with World War II, and I know it's not exactly the same. It's way more similar than I thought it was. This is kind of crazy actually that we went through all of this and then we went through it all again like 20 years later. Oh my gosh. The last bit that he was talking about with the technology, I've mentioned in previous videos that that's one of the more fascinating aspects of this for me, is just learning about the advancements of warfare and how they dealt with that in World War I. Because I like technology and, you know, learning about the evolution of it and, you know, how people adapted to it and, you know, just how it changed the world. But yeah, I guess I'm just a little, like, shocked right now. It's hard to put into words. Look, like, how much of this I don't know about. I guess to simplify it, learning history broadens your perspective on the world. And it's just mind-blowing to me how narrow and small my view of the world is. So yeah, on that note, I guess I'm gonna wrap this up, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hopefully you can answer my questions down in the comments, or just if you have anything to add to the discussion in this video, please do that. And if you enjoyed this video and you enjoy the videos on my channel, I'd appreciate a subscribe and a like as well. I've also got links to my social media and Discord and Patreon in the description of the video and in my pinned comment if you guys are interested in any of that stuff. So yeah, we'll be back with week 7 and 8 before too long. And Roger here and I really appreciate you guys watching this. I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the series. It's going to be a long haul, I realize that. Yeah, so stay tuned for weeks 7 and 8 coming up, and we'll see you then.